Welcome to the Future of Work in a Post-COVID-19 World social webinar. I'm your host today, Cory Treffiletti, and I am joined by three other people. I have Aruna Ravichandran, who is the VP and CMO of Cisco Collaboration. And I also have two of the top analysts in the entire world covering the collaboration category. I have Dave Michels, who's the principal analyst and founder of Talking Points, and Zeus Kerravala, who's the founder and principal analyst with ZK Research. And so we're going to have a conversation today where we're going to take a step back and we're going to look at what's happened over the last 3 or 4 weeks. About 3 weeks ago, we all woke up one morning and almost overnight, immediately, the entire world decided to work from home. This concept was pretty much unimaginable prior to this. It was never something that any company projected or forecasted for because it's almost too unrealistic. It is the new reality. It's going to happen indefinitely. And it's all because of this pandemic around the coronavirus and COVID-19. So it's really forcing companies to rethink about the ways that they approach the concept of remote work. It's really changing the future of work. It's changing the way people are looking to transform how their workplaces operate. So it'd be a great opportunity for us to sit here and have a cool conversation about what does some of this mean and what does some of this look like for the companies that we all work at and that you all work at and that we all interact with. So with that, I'm going to open it up. So my first question I'm going to just pose for all three of you, but from a personal perspective, you've all been responding to the pandemic in your own way. Your own job has been forced you to respond in a certain way. What are some of the things that have really, really disrupted the way you're working, or how has your day-to-day changed in the last 2 or 3 weeks? Zeus, do you want to start?
Sure, and it's not two of the top industry analysts. I think it's safe to say we're the top two. So I don't know why.
I said that incorrectly.
It's not like, it's not like Cisco analysts 3 and 4 either, right? So, so that kind of makes some sense. As an independent analyst, I know Dave is similar. We've worked remotely for a long time. We have a lot of comfort with these tools. I think what's different though is that certainly the conference season, right? The springtime is normally heavy conference season. That's gone away and been replaced by a lot of virtual conferences. I do a lot of in-person meetings as well. Those have been replaced with this. And so what was the exception is now become norm for me, where I would use tools like WebEx all the time to conduct interviews and do virtual meetings, things like that. But it would be sprinkled into a bunch of live meetings and conferences and different types of events. And now those have all been converted to this. And so now, from an adjustment standpoint, I've had to become comfortable in a world where this is now not just an augmentation to the way I work, but really the primary way I work. And for all intents and purposes, for the foreseeable future, the only way I'll work.
Mm-hmm. Hey, what about you?
Well, certainly less travel is the biggest change for me, and I have to say it's a significant upgrade. And I travel a lot, particularly as Zeus just mentioned, in the spring and the fall, and as a result of that, I have status and benefits and all this wonderful stuff. But bottom line is, it's still a pain, and I'd much rather not deal with it. I've got a lot more control over my time. I've got a lot more control over my diet. I've got a lot more control over, how everything, basically, a lot more control. And it's unbelievable how ridiculous travel has become. Just a simple flight out to see Aruna in California. It's just a 2-hour flight, but by the time you drive in, factor in the driving time, getting to the airport early, the TSA time, all that stuff, and then getting from the airport to wherever you're going. Even a short trip is half a day, and that's generally we do what we can. We try to be productive, but being in home office or any office for that matter is much more productive.
Although I will say Cisco does serve the best food at their events, so I kind of miss that. But
you do have.
Yeah.
Aruna, what about you?
So I manage a global team, and so even though I basically work out of the office most of the time, given the fact that I manage a global team, for me it's been a very, very smooth transition to be able to work out of the home. Having said that, the only part which I find a little bit of a heartburn is that I don't see a difference between weekdays and weekends. And so because since you're working from home all the time, and so the days go one by one, and I don't see a transition between Friday and Saturday and Sunday because you don't have a lot of key things you can actually do outside your home. And so that's the only part which I think is a little bit different. But outside that, I'm a huge
Is it the only part, Aruna? Because the other way that you can look at that is the work week is now the weekend, right? And so
exactly right. Exactly right. So going back to that, there were already stats out there in the market which said that, people on the average, teleworkers on the average were 30 to 40% more productive. But I would say, given COVID, given the fact that all of us are working 7 days of the week, I actually think that number is higher. You're probably going to be more productive while you're working virtually because you're not going to have a lot of interruptions. And the days stretch longer. You're not going to be spending time commuting to the office, so which means that if you have a long commute early hours in the morning or during the later half of the day, you're going to be saving that time because you're going to continue to work the entire time. And so I would say there are pluses and minuses. And for me, I have not seen much of a difference.
Now, it's interesting because you just mentioned, Aruna, you're really talking about that way that people have been blurring their personal and their work lives. And I know that from my own perspective, I'm here having this conversation with all of you. And Dave, I get a nice view into your personal tastes with Captain Picard right behind you. And it's interesting to see how people are becoming more connected on an individual basis because they're getting a glimpse into people's individual lives. Do you all agree with that? Have you seen those kinds of connections that are potentially actually increasing interpersonally?
Well, just to clarify, I just found that nobody listened to me until I got him behind me, and once he was there, people started listening and paying attention. So that's the only reason he's there. But actually, it's really interesting to me how with this everyone working at home suddenly, forcibly, I'm surprised how much of a change it was for so many people. Now, obviously, when you're forced to do anything that you weren't doing before, it's a big change. And I don't mean to play that down, but, the concept of teleworking has been around for so long. And, like Zeus mentioned, we've been doing it for 10 years that it seemed more or less kind of in the mainstream to me, but clearly it wasn't, because the amount of conversations and change and disruption that's occurred over this past couple of weeks has been significant. And it's got me, because I've been getting so many questions and so many interactions around this, really thinking about, what was the adjustment period and how things have changed. I'm sure we're going to talk more about some of that stuff. But one thing, Aruna mentioned she's got an international team. One thing as remote workers is we really have to work hard to actively communicate. You don't have those casual hallway conversations or parking lot conversations or lunchroom conversations, whatever. So to compensate for that, you have to actively communicate, which is something not natural for a lot of people.
Yeah, this is something, and we're sort of the anomaly on this because we do tend to use these tools a lot. Yeah, I think something that everyone has to remember, especially business leaders and managers, is that there's a lot of people in the workforce that have never worked remotely and they never work from home and they're not comfortable with these tools. And I know I've talked to some companies where the working from home it does make them feel somewhat socially isolated from their peers. And so one of the recommendations I've had with business leaders is set aside time for your employees and your managers to set up just smaller group meetings where you can mimic water cooler talk. So perhaps, we're deep in the middle of NFL free agency. Set up a time when people can hop on a video call for 30 minutes and discuss the latest goings on there, or talk about what's going on in the world news, things like that, right? So I do think people do need that social interaction. I think you can get one of the risks with working this way is you can get very formal, get on your calls, get off them, and then you miss that sort of thing. So these tools can help you be more productive, like you mentioned, Aruna, but I also think that, to some of the stuff you were talking about, Dave, it can help you be more social as well. And in fact, it's a great time to perhaps build relationships with people that are outside your office that you may not have built relationships with before. So I think take this time as an opportunity to build a broader set of colleagues.
What I can add to that is that, so one of the key things which we are actually seeing, given that, we power the world's largest collaboration platform across the board, is that we have seen a huge increase in terms of the growth of the video meeting minutes. Right. So we always, Chuck, our CEO, actually shared some of the stats externally recently in terms of how our usage metrics are growing. The part which basically stood out for me was that the level of video adoption. And so then if you think about it, why is the video adoption growing, in those kind of numbers? The reason is, like you said, Zeus, when you are in the office, you have the opportunity to have that face-to-face interaction. You can basically do the water cooler talks. But when you're actually working remotely, people actually crave that personal interaction. And the only way you can actually get the personal interaction is by turning on your video. You have the opportunity to basically see your colleagues. You have the opportunity to see your managers, your coworkers, your partners, or whoever you're actually working with. And so I would say that's where, when you think about the personalization, and again, you also get a glimpse into people's personal life, right? So by working from home, some folks might actually have a home office, some might not have it. And so they'll have to basically scramble and put an office together if they have to join a meeting. And so it also brings that personal element in a very huge way. So I, for example, learned a couple of key things about multiple different of my team members just by looking at their background. And so I would say this whole remote work with the video, by joining your conference calls using video, it basically helps you connect in a much more personal level with your underlying audiences, which you might have not had the opportunity to know or work before.
Yeah, actually, a good example of that was we did some of the analysts did a call with Susie Wheat, who runs Cisco's DevNet program. And her daughter Maya was running back and forth in the back, so she actually brought up to say hi to everybody. So that was kind of cute. But that's not something you would normally do in the office, right? But it does bring a personal element to the person that you wouldn't have had before.
And not only that, it's not just kids, right? You get to see pets.
Yeah.
You get to see various different things you probably wouldn't have had a glimpse of.
Well, that explosion in growth that you're seeing on WebEx, I think that's coming obviously from two different things that are very important. One is obviously the virus and people are staying at home, but what's really happened here is that working from home and video communications has gone from a luxury or a nice to have to a necessity and an issue of safety. So that's obviously caused a big explosion. But the other thing is, and this is important, is that video was already exploding, and we were seeing it a month ago. 6 weeks ago, the explosion was in room systems, particularly huddle room systems. And so if you have two groups meeting in two different huddle rooms, you might have 8 people involved in a meeting there, but it was only 2 devices as far as WebEx was concerned. All of a sudden, now that's 8 people, connections. And so it was already exploding. We were seeing tremendous growth for the past 2 or 3 years in this huddle room space. So it was already kind of in motion, and we just kind of took that one step further by putting everybody remote.
I actually think what's going to happen, the byproduct of this is that video, people have asked me, will people stop flying when this is over? And I don't think that's the case. I think once Corona settled down, everyone's going to hop back on planes. I do think the big impact will be those audio calls will largely be replaced by video calls. People are getting much more comfortable with video, and organizations I worked with that only ever did audio calls before are now doing video calls. And so now I think people are starting to realize how easy these systems are to use. And Dave, even the point you made around huddle rooms, those systems, the reason we've seen an uptake is because the systems are easier to use. They're all-in-one solutions, which they weren't before. And so every bit of research I've ever done shows that video usage begets more video usage. It's hard to get people across that hurdle, but once they are, they use it more. And what this has done is it's forced people to get across that hurdle.
One other thing I'll also add to that is that, yes, we were seeing a huge increase in terms of video adoption before COVID. But I would say the increase is, way, way, way higher right now. So the increase is close to about 166% in the last 2 weeks for video adoption. But if you think about it, it's also because, like I said, you crave the personalization, which you're not able to get when you're actually in the office. And so I would say that, and is that going to continue? I would say, hell yes. And like you said, Zeus, as people are getting exposed to these video conferencing tools and they're starting to use videos, they might have not used videos before, even if they actually worked virtually. I think one part of the thing which is actually going to stick even after COVID is that, more and more people are actually going to use the video conferencing tools, not just audio. Yeah. It's going to be a cultural transformation there.
Yeah, I want to go down that route for a second. I want to specifically talk about that cultural transformation because this is a whole new paradigm. It's really going to affect a lot of businesses. I'm curious, first of all, what you all think about that change. What's that going to be like in the future? And one of the things that specifically I want to call out, Zeus, you kind of just mentioned that people are doing these video calls, and I find that it makes the day more structured. There's less off-the-cuff conversation, significantly more regimented, more rigid structure to a day. I'm curious if you all see that and if you think that's part of the cultural transformation that we might have.
Yeah, I actually think one of the interesting aspects of this too is that video calling and meetings have blurred, right? And this is something I know Cisco's talked about for a while. What's the difference between a meeting and a call? Before you might have set up an ad hoc call, but now you just send a WebEx link, right? And you do a meeting. And I think the two are tightly coming together, which makes sense why I think Cisco WebEx meetings and Teams are coming together. But I think people are much more comfortable using these things for structured things which we have in the past. But I think the other aspect is more for ad hoc, right? So if I want to have a conversation with you, I'll just shoot you my WebEx link, and then we'll have a quick conversation. So it's both sides. It's structured, but it's also ad hoc. And I think the younger generation who FaceTime and things like that, they've been very comfortable with video in their personal lives, and so this is really just an extension of that. It's just some of the older people took a little while to get involved.
There's certainly, Zio says that the planes will get busy again and will return to flying. I agree with that. I don't believe that we're going to return to the office like we did before. I think that a lot of companies, there's been a number of examples. Shopify was one that, is actually giving their employees money to go buy equipment and get set up for working at home. And, I think that the office environment, well, first off, I wrote a few months back, the office is a terrible place to work. It's full of germs and distractions, but the office is not a good place anymore, right? Nobody wants to be at the office. Nobody wants to drive to the office. The open floor plans have made them less desirable than they were. So we go to the office not to work as much as we used to, at least knowledge workers. We go to the office to interact. And so I think we're going to see more meeting spaces and more, huddle rooms and stuff like that, where you can actually ideate together and do work together. But the idea of the dedicated cube or the dedicated desk, I think those days are numbered. And, there's been pandemics before. We've talked before whether, this pandemic is going to just, we'll just go right back after this is all over. But the difference between this one and previous issues is the alternative. We have a viable alternative, and we've never had services. WebEx is easy to use, as Zeus has mentioned. We all have access to broadband internet or broadband networking. We have access to affordable equipment. We have good cameras. Products like WebEx have the whiteboard functionality built into it. It's more intuitive than it used to be. It was, just 15 years ago, a video call was very expensive and intimidating. You needed a note from a doctor to use it. It wasn't like it is today. And so I think that this experience is forcing people, maybe against their will, to embrace this. I don't think we're going to just turn it off when we're done.
I 100% agree on that. I also think that I actually think that a lot of organizations, enterprises are also going to find out that there is going to be a lot of fringe benefits they're actually going to get. So what is that? So many of these enterprises who really did not have a work from home culture are scrambling now, putting the necessary infrastructure in place, equipping their employees to be able to work from home, because they don't know whether this COVID period is actually going to a couple of months or it's going to end in a couple of days. And so they need to make sure that they are setting that and enabling their employees to be able to work from home. So given that there is so much work happening already in terms of companies and enterprises to be able to provision the infrastructure, get the right equipment, get the right technology in place, they'll also figure out that, wow, we did not have this as a part of our cultural transformation. We did not really encourage remote work before, but now I can see some of the benefits which we are actually going to get with remote work. One is, like I said, a huge productivity and performance increase. previously, before even COVID, the productivity and performance increase was close to 40% if when people actually worked remotely. Now, given COVID, now that the infrastructure is in place, now the best practices are in place where people are actually going to figure out, I think more and more employers will become much more flexible in terms of being able to embrace remote work. The second
because the concept of will we return back to normal, the idea of what is normal is constantly changing. And if this virus is going to last a year or so, then suddenly remote work at home becomes the normal one.
Exactly right. That is your future of work, right? So future of work right now is remote work. But since people are getting acclimated in a hurry, all IT organizations for various different enterprises, government officials, everybody is scrambling and figuring out what are the necessary tools, infrastructure, capacity, bandwidth requirements they need to put in place. And if this basically stretches for a long period of time, maybe I would say 2-3 months or longer, this would become the new normal. And they would also understand that there are going to be a lot of additional benefits they're actually going to get. Some of the benefits people already know, especially for the millennial as well as the Gen Z population, they actually like the ability to work where they actually want. And so retention would be another benefit in terms of being able to enable employees to be able to work from home. And the other aspect is profitability. You don't need to basically hop on the plane. You'll basically save a lot of money in terms of travel costs, and productivity costs also basically go up. So what we need to see is how long is this pandemic going to last? Will this become a new norm, and will enterprises actually provide this as an added fringe benefit as a part for people to be able to work from home? I actually think that is going to be the cultural transformation which is going to happen post-COVID.
Yeah. Now, let me ask you a question that comes off of that. Especially for Zeus and for Dave, Aruna, you also talk to a lot of these companies. What should these companies be thinking about as this becomes the new normal, as this becomes established as a crucial and a very, very important part of how they structure their culture going forward? Like, what are some of the things that they should be thinking about now that maybe they haven't started to really think about?
I think there's a lot of things. I mean, I worry sometimes that maybe we're oversimplifying this, and that people like Dave and I and Aruna, to perhaps a lesser extent, because I know you're in the office a lot, are used to working from home every day. For a lot of employees, they work from home 1 day a week, 2 days a week, not every day. And I do think some find it a little monotonous, or they're really unsure of how to juggle things. If somebody comes to the door, they're worried that their manager might be upset if they leave the phone, things like that. So I think there's a certain rules of the road that companies need to lay out, right? That if you're you're working at home and your kid's there and your kid needs you, go attend to your kid, right? Don't think that that's a bad thing to do, right? Especially now that everybody's home. Make sure you take proper breaks during the day. If you stack up back-to-back calls and you're sitting in the same place every day, that gets a little tiring, and there isn't a cafeteria to go to, things like that, right? So I think where companies can really help is employees understand what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, how to work. They can help them even with mental health counselors to help them bridge that gap for somebody. Again, it's not the professional teleworker that I'm worried about here. It's the people that have never ever worked from home that are having to jump into this now, and they'll probably like it over time, but I think it's a bit of a learned behavior. And that's, I think, where companies can help. The other area too is just logistics, right? Where should your office desk be set up? What kind of lighting do you need? I've often done calls with people where they have bright windows in the background and you can't see their face because the lighting's bad, or they don't have a proper workspace. So companies can help with a lot of logistics inside a home to help them understand how to set up a workspace and understand what's okay and what's not okay.
I can add to that.
I would just say that there's a learning curve with any kind of change, and that you have to be patient and understand that. And whenever something's new, you invariably compare it to the way things were, and you try to emulate the way things were. But the reality is things are different. And one of the things we hear about video calls all the time is they never start on time. And one of the question I throw back is, well, do your in-person meetings start on time? And the answer is, well, not really. People come in late and things happen. And there's lots of reasons why meetings don't start on time. And there's still lots of reasons why meetings don't start on time. But but there's this, I'm not 100% productive at home. Well, are you 100% productive at the office? Based on how many conversations I'm having with people about that social piece that's missing, I would say people are not 100% productive at the office because they're definitely missing their social component. So you don't want to necessarily compare it to the way things were. You want to embrace the way things can be. And there's a lot of benefits if you get out of that shell of trying to make it the way it was. So there's some good tips, like maybe maintaining a schedule and getting dressed for work and things like that. And maybe that helps with the transition. There's also some things that you can do that you couldn't do before. I like to tell people that my office hours are 10 to 2 twice a day, and that I have an evening shift where I get a lot of my work done, and I'm a night owl, so 2 in the morning's fine. Then I sleep in, then I have a really productive 4-hour shift in the morning with lots of phone calls and meetings like this. And people say, well, why would you want a split shift? And I kind of look back at them and say, why would you want to work 8 hours straight? That makes no sense. So you can do things differently in a telework environment if your workflow and your environment allows that to work. So maybe my example isn't right for other people, but there's things you can do that are different. And whenever there's something to change, it takes a while to discover that.
Well, I think your point, Dave, is there's no right or wrong. Right. It's really dependent on the person and the organization and whatever they feel comfortable with. Some jobs you couldn't do split shifts, some you can, right? But it's finding something that works for everybody.
So the other thing we are actually finding here from Cisco, I'm pretty sure a lot of companies are also thinking about that is, as leaders, we actually had a call yesterday with Fran, our EVP of HR, as well as all of the folks in HR, where we're thinking about, what are some of the key leadership strategies which are necessary in order to manage a remote workforce. And so I'll basically break it up into 4 different areas which people need to think about. The first one is being able to clarify goals and roles. It's easier to do in a face-to-face environment. And so now the whole company has actually shifted to a remote work. So you need to make sure as a leader that you can re-clarify the goals and responsibilities so that you can encourage peer-to-peer communication. You can assess and reassess key priorities. I've done this myself because when you're working from home, you have to think about what are things you need in order to keep lights on and how can you reassess your priorities in order to basically encourage remote work. And like you said, Zeus, as well as Dave, communication. You don't have that face-to-face opportunity. And so being able to over-communicate is the right strategy, especially when you think about remote work. So first one's clarify goals and roles. The second one was being able to emphasize personal interactions, right? So you have to keep everyone in mind. Not everyone is used to basically working from home, and you guys already called that out. Some people work from home all the time. Some people are mobile workers. Some people work in the office predominantly. And so how do all of these people actually going to adapt to this work from home environment? And so in order to do that, schedule regular meetings. Communication, like I said, is important. And like Zeus, like you said, because you can't have that face-to-face water cooler, schedule virtual water cooler meetings. Welcome new ideas for the team. So that way you can further continue to emphasize personal interactions. The third one is about being able to map skills and capacity. Because when you're working from home, you need to really assess the need for external resources. You need to think about, do you need to build new skill sets in the organization? Because some people might not be able to adapt to the work from home culture. And last but not the least, what are going to be some new routes to market which will actually emerge as a result of this remote work? And the fourth area is about being able to normalize new work styles. Right? So being able to acknowledge non-traditional workspaces, and you guys called that out. So people could be, people might not have dedicated work space in their homes. So being able to understand that there are going to be various different backgrounds, there are going to be surprises sometimes in meetings. There could be surprises with background noise, with kids, with pets. So being able to acknowledge non-traditional spaces is important. Being able to support flex work time is important. And making sure that you actually have that virtual engagement going so that you can clear out any kind of ambiguities is also an important part of the equation as a leadership team.
Yeah, you're talking about the managers have to manage differently is, I think, that's somewhat you're saying.
Exactly right.
And that's not something that I think a lot of them are comfortable with.
Mm-hmm.
Those are all really great points. And I think you all three hit on a lot of stuff that was it's important for individuals to be able to think about. I'm curious, I want to dive one more deeper layer in though. From a company perspective, with all this distributed workforce, how does security play into this? How does a company have to think about security when there's nobody actually in the office and everything is being done remotely?
Well, I mean, security is everything now, right? It's tough to mandate security when you've got the hard shell around your perimeter. Now that the perimeter is nowhere and everywhere, I think it's time for companies to relook at a lot of the tools that they use. Things like multi-factor authentication tools like Cisco Duo, which historically have been kind of a pain in the neck to use, right? But they've gotten a lot better of late. Lets people use some simpler passwords than you would have to, the Google suggested one or something like that, but still maintain that highest level of security. CASB tools can be a good way of making sure people are using corporate authorized tools. If you're working from home, it's very easy to just go get your consumer type of file sharing program and use that. So I think companies have to have a lot more structure and a lot more visibility into the activities people are doing to make sure that they're protected, because it's you no longer, like I said, have everybody behind that firewall, and now that security needs to be a lot more distributed out to the endpoint. So it's too expensive to extend the corporate environment out to everybody's home. I mean, you can with VPNs, but that only partially does it. And then you do need some different types of tools. And to me, CASB and multi-factor are just two of the critical ones.
Dave, anything to comment there?
I'll just throw in, the Zeus just mentioned VPNs, and VPNs have been a surprising bottleneck in this rush to the work from home. Services like WebEx work the same whether you're in the office or at home. Office 365 or G Suite works the same whether you're at an office or at home. Where a lot of companies seem to be getting in trouble is their VPN infrastructure, which wasn't scaled to facilitate all their employees suddenly being remote. And there's also policies around that. Can employees do work on personal computers? Do they have to, so now there's this mad rush to buy new corporate computers, expand VPN, put that on there. These are the things that seem to be causing the gridlocks in this massive move to work from home. But yeah, security is obviously important, and generally, with cloud services, like the ones I mentioned, they tend to work pretty well without additional security. And so, in some cases, you have to educate employees that if you're trying to access G Suite, don't use the VPN capacity. Do that separately. Use the VPN for some of the other stuff. But yeah, the VPN's been kind of the weak link that I think caught people off guard.
Yeah, I agree. I talked to one company. They said it takes their help desk was telling me it takes 30 minutes on average to walk an average user through setting up a VPN, and that's been crushing their help desk. And there are good alternatives to that. Instead of using a shared file service inside the company, you can use one of the online ones. But that's a big pivot companies have to make, and this really underscores the power of the cloud, right? That all the ones you mentioned, Dave, are all cloud apps. Right, where a lot of companies still haven't moved everything to the cloud, and so that's where the VPNs are necessary. And personally, I'd like to see us get rid of VPNs and get rid of passwords and find better solutions. But I think they're here to stay for a little while, anyways.
Let me ask another question in this regard, right? So you guys address the security part with respect to identity management as a service with respect to VPN. But what about security loopholes when compared to the video conferencing tools? Because I've seen a lot of conversations out there, and saw one yesterday. I'm not sure whether you guys saw that. I think the UK minister, the government in UK basically decided to change their technology from one of our competitors, mainly because there was a big security loophole in the video conferencing solution. And so what are your thoughts on that? Because in my mind, when we look at WebEx, we actually have pride ourselves that we are the world's #1 most secure, most reliable, as well as the most scalable platform. And security is in our DNA. And so I want to basically ask you guys your opinion, not specific to the identity management tools or the VPN security tools or the firewalls, but more with respect to security when it comes to the video conferencing solution.
Well, it's not just video. These aren't just video conferencing solutions anymore. People are storing files in them. people are, making comments in them. You could have your executive team discussing earnings through the chat capabilities, right? So there's a lot of implications to securing these different video and meeting tools. And you're right, it is hard for the average buyer, especially one that's more on the UC side or communication side, to understand, because every vendor will list a bunch of security things they do, but they're not all created equal. And I know Cisco's putting a lot of investment into making sure that the entire end-to-end communications path is secured. And this is something where I think as companies go through the evaluation process of which tools to use, they really need to bring some of their security people in and have them understand the differences, because they can all everybody can check a box today and says, yes, we're secure. But the depth of what that means is quite different, and it's very difficult for buyers to understand, especially ones that don't have a security background.
No, but so let me ask you another question on that, right? So one of the things is, given that collaboration tools like video conferencing are now the hottest topic across the board. If you look at the top 10 business apps within the App Store, you'll find that all the tools are going to be collaboration tools. So one of the key things I'm seeing on social media is that as people are actually advertising their social hour parties or their yoga parties or whatever, I'm seeing a lot more conversations where, for example, one of our recent competitors, which I saw yesterday, is that they actually expose the meeting ID. And so when you have your meeting ID exposed on social, when people are actually taking photographs of their meeting and the meeting ID shows up on the top, you now have an opportunity to basically click on the link and join a meeting. So you can actually bomb and join a private meeting across the board. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's part of what I was saying is every vendor out there can check we're secure, but but they may not be, right? There's some element of security built into every vendor's tools, but it's every person buying these tools needs to do some homework to understand all the different implications and all the different areas that need to be secured. And certainly what you mentioned poses a lot of risk. Like, if you're bombing somebody's video yoga, I don't think it really matters, but you could be using these tools to discuss corporate earnings or M&A or something like that, and then it would matter.
Exactly right.
Right. And so I think this isn't a case of good enough is good enough anymore, right? If we're extending, if every worker is using these tools, and we're discussing a lot of press releases, NDA information, or earnings, things like that, even the concept of hiring people, right? If you do an interview with somebody who's a top talent working at another company, that could create big news, right? So that's where buyers, like I said, do need to do their due diligence and understand all the different levels of security in what that means in these meeting tools, because our industry's done a less than good job, I would say, at helping educate the buyers on what the security implications are, and that's because most of them aren't very secure.
Yeah. So we're getting close to the end of this conversation. I want to throw out maybe one or two more questions. What do you think in terms of the different types of new use cases for remote work? What are you seeing out there that maybe is a brand new opportunity for people as they're starting to embrace these technologies?
I can start with that. One is, at least from what we are seeing with respect to Cisco in terms of the outreaches we have had, right? So remote work for enterprises, without a doubt, the level of scale and growth has been tremendous. The second big use case, which we are actually seeing right now, is telehealth and remote healthcare. So why is that becoming much more important now? One is, according to the World Health Organization, they basically advertise stats with respect to if this COVID pandemic actually becomes prevalent, the healthcare system will actually break down. So why is that? So the ratio of the number of hospital beds to the number of people it can actually accommodate is staggering. For every 1,000 people, there are only 5 hospital beds. And in the US, for every 1,000 people, there are only 2.5 doctors. So if this pandemic becomes very prevalent across the board here within the United States or even all around the world, the whole healthcare system is completely going to break down. And so day before yesterday, they actually passed a law where they relaxed the laws with respect to telehealth and remote healthcare, where they said that if you are a Medicare patient or if you basically have any public Medicare or Medi-Cal, you now have the ability to basically get reimbursed by joining your conversations through telehealth. So which means that video conferencing technology as well as the rich chat tools are going to become a very important part of the use case. If it does not, and this whole healthcare system will actually break down, because if doctors are getting sick, if patients who come for various different reasons and they basically get coronavirus, then the whole healthcare system will actually break down. And so that is the second use case. We have seen a tremendous increase across the board. The third use case is in the education vertical. Right? So if you think about the education vertical, that one is a huge one, because if you look at the K-12 universities as well as remote education, very, very few K-12 education as well as the universities had remote learning. So if in K-12, full online classes were less than 5% worldwide. For education, there was at least about 34% of universities who at least had one online class. It's not a fully embraced online system, but at least there was some amount of virtual learning. Given that 50.8 million students in the United States are actually impacted, so we have seen a huge increase in terms of every university, every college, every K-12 education who are actually scaling and moving into virtual learning. And so that's another area which we have. And because of that, we actually have an educational free offer for our education vertical. So that way, people will be able to get through the pandemic for the next 90 days.
Well, you asked which industries are kind of new or new use cases, but first I want to emphasize how many industries continue to work fine now, which wasn't possible a few years ago. We've had, a good 5 years of digital transformation initiatives happening in the workplace. And so, I look at an episode of Mad Men or something like that, where they're all in the conference room, and they're all in the conference room almost invariably to look at artwork the artist downstairs drew to pitch in an ad. Well, today that artwork is drawn on a computer, and almost everything we do, whether it's designing cars or buildings or most businesses, because of, like I said, 5 years of digital transformation, have been putting everything online or on a computer. So many more businesses now can do remote work because you can share content so effectively online. Now, the use cases, certainly telehealth is a great example. It's not a new use case, but when there's a shortage of masks and you're dealing with an infectious disease, it's a great use case. Education, I got a son in college, and he's told me all classes have been canceled for the rest of the school year, and they're all going online, and he keeps on sending me messages about what they're doing and what products they're using. It's really, really interesting how education is suddenly embracing online, because online education, again, isn't new. We've been, companies like Coursera have been out there for quite some time, but we haven't seen a drop off in traditional enrollments. Now all the major universities are figuring out online education, which is, fantastic. A couple of totally new use cases that are kind of mind-boggling, but again, makes sense. Funerals. Funerals were never done online, to my knowledge, unless you're a celebrity or something like that in the past. But now, there's lots of hugging and lots of crowds, and they don't want people having funerals, and we happen to have an increase in deaths. And so funerals are going online, and I think that's a fantastic and interesting use case. And there's going to be so many more use cases as the reality sits in that we are stuck at home and can't go into an office or can't go in crowds. It'll be interesting to see. We've seen concerts being played in empty concert halls that are being broadcast out. We're seeing sports being played in empty sports halls. It'll be really interesting to see how this industry really embraces online connectivity in totally new and exciting ways.
Yeah, I think one of the aspects of telemedicine too that we're forgetting about is that it's much easier, right? So I wrote about this actually in 2015, where elderly people and mothers with 4 kids and things like that don't like to drive halfway across the city to see a specialist to show them a bruise, right? You could easily do that over video and then save hours and hours of time. I actually experienced it myself at the beginning of the year. I was in Kauai and I was kind of sick, and there wasn't urgent care around, and the app, the urgent care facility had a video-based doctor. You just went on and you talked to the doctor a little bit, and it saved me a few hours of having to sit and wait in an urgent care lobby. So that's use case. Another one is for banks. Not every bank branch has experts in it. And right now, all banks are closed, and that you have to go through the drive-through teller. If you want to do something like apply for a mortgage, or if you want to open a new account, a lot of banks have set up video to do that with. So why wouldn't you do that before? Like prior to that, if I wanted to open a mortgage in a little branch in a grocery store, I'd have to schedule a time that was convenient for me and a mortgage specialist to come in and sit down and talk about it. Right now, you can do it over video. So I think there's almost every industry can benefit from the use of video, especially ones where you have a lot of people moving around, and like healthcare, education, banking, retail.
And speaking of moving around, I actually had a little bit of a history with criminal justice system. Working in that industry for a while, and it's amazing, particularly in prisons, how much energy and cost goes into moving prisoners around and getting them to doctors and getting them to court dates and getting them to meeting with their attorneys and all this stuff. And so criminal justice is actually probably about to go through a radical transformation as they, particularly court hearings and stuff. We've seen that in very specialized cases before where they do that via video. I think we're going to see that kind of move into the mainstream in 2020.
Yeah, a handful of years ago, I wrote a case study of the city of Albuquerque that's using Cisco. They were using Cisco telepresence at the time to do video-based arraignments. And what they found was the cost of transporting a prisoner all the way across the city to do an arraignment hearing was pretty high. And so the mayor there actually used it as a way, part of the re-election campaign. But clearly it increased citizen safety, and they also were able to move to centralized video-based stenographers. So instead of having to pay the cost of having stenographers everywhere, you just have a pool of them in the middle.
The last one I might also add, and you guys all mentioned it, is the other area which is getting disrupted is virtual events. Right, so we saw Mobile World Congress. We have seen our own Cisco Lives get canceled. There are a boatload of events which are getting canceled, and we're also seeing that companies did not know how to host an internal town hall. I've had several different CIOs who have reached out to us because they haven't had the infrastructure set up in order to host a town hall. And so the whole world is also moving towards virtual learning, not just for students, but also for virtual events, so that you can actually, the shows need to go on, the learning needs to continue to happen, and all of these use cases will still need a transition to the remote work.
Yeah. So I'd like to take a pause here for a second and start to kind of wrap it up. And I think it's an interesting place to do that. And I wrote down 3 things that I'd like to hit on. First of all, I think that we all agree that we're seeing the forced evolution of many industries. It's not something that typically people had planned for, but when you see radical change, it's usually in a forced perspective. And this is definitely that forced evolution for a lot of things. And I think you all hit on a number of them. Aruna mentioned where these events are going, even doing this kind of event, turning it around very quickly and being able to broadcast it on social media, where we're going to have a few thousand people actually listen to it, is very interesting. I also think that it was a great place to stop, and I'm glad we didn't stop on someone commenting around their personal experiences with the criminal justice system. I've never had a moderated conversation go there yet, but once again, it's a really interesting use case that is going to change, and the ability for people to interact and engage in that kind of environment and have that effect it's new. It's very unique. So I think there was a lot of really great points that were brought up here. I was also taught that when you moderate, you should always want to leave the audience wanting more. So I think that this is probably a great place for us to end for today. I think there's a good chance that you'll probably be seeing these people again in another conversation as a continuance of this. So I really want to thank Aruna. I want to thank Zeus. I want to thank Dave. And I want to thank everybody who had a chance to listen to us. And once again, just thank you guys very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Stay safe.